Oh, there we go. That should fix it. So technical difficulties. Welcome everybody to another session of the Organizer Education reading group. Today we're going to be continuing our reading of Full Spectrum Resistance by Eric McBay. This is our 8th session, I believe. And welcome to anybody who showed up. If you want to just listen in as we read through Full Spectrum Resistance, then feel free to just tune into these live streams. But if what you are wanting to do is join in on the discussion and become part of the reading group, then you should go over to our Open Collective and become a recurring donor to Cooperation Tulsa for any amount that you're comfortable with. The link is there in the chat as well as down in the description to the live stream. So I think that is what I would say just to get us started. We have 4 people here in the live stream who are watching us. And welcome. Glad you all showed up. I'll probably spread this link around just a little bit more so that people can. Okay. You can't hear yourself? Huh. Oh, I know why. Ta-da! Now it should work. Say something.
Something. There's a lag, so it takes a second. Yep, it works.
Ta-da! It's almost like I have to have both of them in the room. I have to have both of them on the stage. Success! Excuse me. I'll spread the link around a little bit. How is everybody doing tonight?
It was a Monday. Can't lie, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, there we go. That's not too bad. It could be worse.
It was cold, but I made some chicken and dumplings from scratch. That was pretty good.
That's pretty sweet. Chicken and dumplings. That's a W, as the kids say.
Oh.
That's I have to say, as the kids say, when I say something that's a slang these days. I can't just say it myself because I'm not one of the kids. All right. I think we are all set up and ready to, as he said, no cap, right? No cap. I'm Unk. On God, etc. Tubular. I don't know. Totally. Okay, good. I'm glad that we've all come to an agreement on this. So, that is it for now. Got the link spread around. I think people are aware of the things, the stuff. It's happening. So I am going to get us started reading. So this is in bold text, and it says, fight oppression and gain strength internally while building coalitions and alliances externally. You can't have an effective resistance organization, radical or otherwise, if it is racked internally by oppression or bad group dynamics. There must be a strong basis for unity, at least on short-term and intermediate goals. Set aside some time in your group to discuss your purpose, ways of making your group appropriately inclusive, and to learn and develop your anti-oppressive analysis and practice. Prioritize the voices of people who have been marginalized or underrepresented in your decision-making and strategy development. That doesn't mean everyone has to agree that everything is perfect before undertaking action. That would stall any action and probably collapse the group, something I've seen many times. To the contrary, you have to show people that an organization can achieve success through action. If a movement can't win any victories, why would people bother to stick with it through the slow and difficult work of fighting oppression and building good dynamics? In bold, identify a common enemy and a common struggle. Building resistance is extremely difficult when regular people identify with those in power instead of with each other. As John Steinbeck argued, quote, socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, end quote. In other words, too many people falsely believed that they would one day be at the top of the pyramid. In Nazi Germany, as I discussed, that identification with power hampered serious resistance even after the Nazis were gone. When China was occupied by Japan, Chinese revolutionaries used that common external enemy to build cooperation across the political spectrum from communists to right-wing nationalists. A shared hostility toward those in power has held successful revolutions together throughout history. This was instrumental in the alliance of lesbian and gay organizers with miners in the UK in the 1980s. It is a common enemy that will allow people to bridge their ideological and cultural gaps to fight side by side. And the more imminent the threat they face, the more people will be willing to break old habits and set their differences and conflicts aside. In bold, don't publicly attack allies. Deal with conflicts in confidence, with one exception. Malcolm X argued, quote, instead of airing our differences in public, we have to realize we're all the same family. When you have a family squabble, you don't get out on the sidewalk. End quote. Longtime forced defense organizer Zoe Blunt told me that through hard-won experience, it is a principle of her coalition organizing that coalition members don't make public criticisms of each other. People in successful and serious struggles have often followed this principle even when they have very different tactics. In the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, even a prominent pacifist like Archbishop Desmond Tutu refused to condemn armed resistors. This is not just a matter of courtesy to comrades, it keeps our movements strong in the face of divide and conquer repression. Mohawk Sean Brandt of Tyendinaga told me about Indigenous opposition to a new tax in Ontario a few years ago. Indigenous militants allied themselves with the more official chiefs of Ontario. According to Brandt, the government told the chiefs, quote, we can talk if you aren't associated with bad Indians, end quote. But the chiefs refused to back down and break solidarity, and the government quickly capitulated. Next.
Avoiding public attacks can be an important expression of solidarity, but there must actually be mechanisms for resolving conflict internally, such as third-party mediators, and they must be taken seriously. Otherwise, dangerous conflicts or legitimate grievances might only be suppressed to bubble up later in more damaging ways. I've seen this happen too many times, and it's often heartbreaking. While it's generally good to avoid airing grievances publicly, there is a very important exception to that guideline when we confront patterns of sexist, racist, or otherwise oppressive behavior. Too often, we have seen groups overlook the internal mistreatment of women, people of color, and LGBTQ plus people. Too often, abusers have been ignored or enabled because of their status or positions. Too often, we have heard things like, we don't want to lose that man, he's a good organizer, or just ignore that, it's for the good of the movement. That's bullshit. Solidarity does not mean papering over nasty behavior. Solidarity means siding with the people who are not in a position of power. And it means that people of privilege may have to be uncomfortable and deal with uncomfortable situations. To overlook racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and other oppressions does not make our movement stronger. It makes them weaker and more fragmented. Every time a nasty man like Brandon Darby, see Chapter 6, is protected because he is a, quote, good organizer, a movement will lose 5 or 10 potential organizers who are women or people of color. How many incredible women did the Black Panthers lose because of rampant sexism and misogyny? The whole movement. Conversely, how many fantastic organizers Were Judy Berry and Fred Hampton able to recruit and retain by taking an inclusive and intersectional approach? That doesn't mean every single inappropriate remark needs to be responded to with an open letter of condemnation. There are a variety of options to handle thoughtless or insensitive behavior, many of which can happen within particular groups. We'll come back to this subject in Chapter 6, Security and Safety. But patterns of abuse, sexual harassment, or other kinds of oppressive aggression must be confronted openly within our movement. In bold, avoid bringing repression down on your allies. During the 1999 WTO protests in Seattle, some of the peaceful protesters took it upon themselves to detain people who smashed windows so that the window smashers could be turned into police. This is a classic illustration of liberals falling for the divide and conquer trap and breaking solidarity. Of course, militants have brought down repression on their allies too, often inadvertently. The weather organization's battle with police at the Chicago Days of Rage in 1969, which Fred Hampton dismissed as Potteristic, was followed by violent police raids on Black communities in the area. We know that occupiers throughout history have used mass punishment and violent reprisals against civilians to try to discourage resistance. We expect that, and it's one of the reasons we fight. But militants have to make sure they accomplish something if they risk triggering reprisals. The Chicago fights with police didn't accomplish much of anything. I also think militants have an obligation to try to take action in a way that will minimize reprisals on others. More generally, this principle also means that activists in general should follow security culture and refuse to give information to the police, since almost any information can be used against our movement. One of the concerns that Starhawk's letter raised was that Black Bloc types would anonymously smash a bunch of windows during a protest and then run away, leaving less mobile and non-clandestine people behind to deal with police repression. This is a legitimate moral concern. It's also a tactical concern, since if a person wants to smash a corporate store window, then the worst possible time to get away with it is when already surrounded by police. If you are going to use a mix of low risk and high risk tactics at a single action, you have to do so carefully. There is actually a military principle we can learn from: combined arms. Next.
Coordinate different tactics and groups as combined arms. Ancient Greeks of the Athenians, used armies that were mostly composed of one kind of fighter, a hoplite armed with shield and spear. Later armies, like those under Philip II of Macedon, adopted a mix of units fighting in the same army: infantry, cavalry, missile troops like archers, and large siege engines like catapults. This diverse combination of fighters was devastatingly effective, because it meant that the Macedonians almost always had the appropriate fighter to attack the weak points of any given enemy. At the same time, their heterogeneous composition meant that their army as a whole had very few weak points, since each unit compensated for the weaknesses of the others. Combined arms are only effective when coordinated and complementary. In World War II, the Allies pushed the Nazis out of occupied countries through the combined use of infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support. But if through confusion, artillery or bombers attacked the same area that infantry was fighting in, the result could be mass injury and death of Allied soldiers. If you were an army commander, you would not fire artillery onto a spot where your own infantry were present, because you could easily blow them all up. Militants, then, may want to avoid violence or police confrontation among non-combatants or peaceful protesters for the same reason that artillery does not fire on Allied infantry. Artillery shells are too explosive and dangerous to be used in close proximity to allies unable to shield themselves from it. There's a set of modern protest guidelines called the St. Paul Principles, in which call for separation of time and place between different kinds of action for just this reason. By holding militant and non-militant events at different times and in different places, we can avoid many of the concerns discussed here. In this chapter, I've written about some big picture dynamics of movements. These can help us to understand very generally why some movements win, why they lose, why they fracture, and how we can get along with allies. But the day-to-day success of a resistance movement rests on the specifics. How do you recruit the people that you need and keep them? How do you organize into groups that can cooperate and get things done? How do you moderate internal conflict? How do you reach out to new allies and supporters? How do you protect yourselves and your comrades from repression? How do you gather the intelligence you need to choose good targets? How do you work out the strategy and tactics you need to mobilize force in a rapidly changing political conflict? And how have movements of the past done these things? I will continue to talk about the big picture and flesh out the ideas and patterns I've already discussed, but it is those specifics that I turn to now. Next.
Chapter 4, Recruitment and Training. Quote, as individual fingers, we can easily be broken, but altogether we make a mighty fist. From Sitting Bull. Title, Coalition for a Free South Africa. In April 1985, the movement against South African apartheid is gaining steam around the world. That movement includes a divestment campaign meant to deprive corporations complicit in apartheid of money and shareholders. Social justice organizations and many university campuses have joined in. Such a movement is being organized at Columbia University in New York City, led by the Coalition for a Free South Africa. The CFSA has a steering committee of mostly Black students who make decisions by consensus and a loosely organized group of 50 active supporters. For the last few years, the CFSA has used a traditional strategy of awareness raising. They've held discussion groups and teach-ins about the violence of apartheid. They've been covered in newspapers and on television. By 1983, they convinced the administration, faculty, and student representatives on the university senate to vote unanimously for divestment, but the Board of Trustees overruled that decision. This rejection signaled to student activists that traditional strategy has failed. Professor Eric L. Hirsch, who interviewed students during the ensuing period of conflict, quotes one student who had been optimistic about the Senate vote for divestment. Quote, it hadn't been a bunch of radical youth taking buildings and burning things down to destroy, but rather going through the system. And it seemed to me that for the first time in a really long time, the system was going to work. And then I found out that it hadn't worked, end quote. The CFSA calls for rallies and vigils to condemn the actions of the trustees, but the events are poorly attended. They realize they need to escalate to win. So they plan two simultaneous actions. The steering committee members will stage a hunger strike, and simultaneously the whole group will take over a campus building. In their minds, this will mean chaining the doors shut and blocking the entrance until a small number of people are arrested. It's an extension of the strategy of symbolic awareness raising they have used. The goal is to get media attention. They call a mass rally for the day of the blockade, but keep the blockade plan secret. Turnout at the rally is disappointingly low. Fewer than 200 supporters arrive. Nonetheless, they continue with the plan, give some speeches, and begin the march. The participants expect a routine march with some chanting and speeches. Instead, the march stops at a building called Hamilton Hall. The front doors are already chained shut. The steering committee announces the plan. They will hold those steps until the university agrees to divest. Virtually all of the marchers stay on the steps. Then something surprising happens. Within hours, their numbers nearly double. Organizers are shocked at the enthusiastic response to this riskier action, compared to low participation in much safer events. One steering committee member would record, quote, by noon, there must have been hundreds more people than I expected there would be. I was hoping for 50 people, including the hardcore. We would all get carted off. That's what everyone was expecting. We would have a story written and the press would report that we had done this. Jesus Christ, what happened that day was absolutely mind-boggling." End quote. This new action is dramatic and serious. The CFSA's recent rallies were poorly attended because no one thought they would accomplish anything. But people joined the blockade because, though riskier, it might succeed. Hirsch's survey of the student body shows that before the blockade began, only 9% of students considered themselves at least somewhat active in the campaign for divestment. But a whopping 37% of the entire student body participated directly in the blockade of Hamilton Hall, either by joining rallies or sleeping overnight on the steps. They joined because they think they can win. Some of the blockaders are taking real risks. 6 go on a hunger strike to request a meeting with the university president and trustees. Within a few weeks, 2 are in the hospital. Some of the blockaders are South African. They risk imprisonment when they return home. Even the students who risk less are galvanized by the personal sacrifice of their comrades. There again is that Overton window. But this is not a protest of glorious martyrs with an outer circle of disciples. The blockaders deliberately use inclusive, participatory decision-making processes. There are long meetings and discussions on the steps. Those present try to use consensus as much as possible, though they occasionally fall back on voting. The university administration decides to target individual students with punitive action to disrupt the blockade. They call disciplinary hearings. They send letters threatening suspension and expulsion. They target the CFSA organizers, as well as students who had little prior political engagement on campus. But these attacks only strengthened the resolve of the blockaders. Eventually, 500 people signed a declaration taking personal responsibility for the blockade. So the administration settles on a different approach. Wait the blockaders out. And by the 3rd week of the occupation, energy among the protesters begins to diminish. Some of them begin to describe the blockade as a chore. Media coverage wanes. For reporters, the blockade is old news. The blockaders do not simply trickle away. Rather, they intelligently evaluate their strategic situation, and as a group, they decide to end their blockade so that they can put their energy into new initiatives. They conclude the blockade with another march, en masse, into Harlem. And in 5 months, the Board of Trustees gives in. Columbia University divests. Next.
I believe it's me, unless somebody else jumped in line. Let me check the chat. Yep. Okay. The story of the CFSA illustrates a central argument of this book. People will fight when they think they can win, even if it's only a small victory on the way to greater success. They need some kind of attainable objective. Resistance movements are made of people. To succeed, movements must constantly recruit new people while strengthening communities of resistance and developing the skills of existing members. This is not easy. If we want our movements to grow, there are questions we must answer. How do individual people become politically engaged? How do they become radicals or militants? What is the relationship between this individual process and the way that whole movements form and develop? More practically, how do individual groups and organizations reach and recruit new members? To do this well, we must also understand what individual people get out of participation, the deep human and community needs that resistance organizations can fulfill. Recruitment is only the first step. Movements must also train and retain their members. What skills do resistors need? How can groups ensure that they keep the people they recruit? And how can movements deal with difficult people who would disrupt the well-functioning groups or drive out valuable members through bad behavior? Let's start with individuals. The title of this section is The Making of a Radical. What makes people choose a quote-unquote career as an activist? For many years, I've asked people about their parents, their childhood, and their paths to activism in conversations on protest marches, on midnight banner drops, in community gardens, in tree sits, and on whaler ramming ships. When the time came to write this book, I reviewed the biographies of many historical radicals and revolutionaries, and I sat down to interview serious activists, some strangers, some old friends, about what made them who they are. Clear patterns emerged. The people I spoke to had important commonalities with each other and with historical figures. Their development as activists was not random, but developed in ways we can understand and even replicate. Let's talk about the broad patterns for a few pages and then come back to practicalities. This section titled Conformity and Character. Whether they are fighting a foreign occupation or domestic oppressions, from apartheid to patriarchy, resistors face a difficult struggle. As a resistor, you have no guarantee of victory in your lifetime. Things may get worse. You may be punished for doing what is right. To win, you have to risk comfort, privilege, status, and perhaps your life. To succeed may require that you defy friends and family, colleagues, school officials, religion, even your own country. Most people will not do these things. In Deep Green Resistance, I examined some of the psychology of conformity and resistance. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch found that a person's most basic visual perception can be overridden by group opinion. Stanley Milgram's famous experiments demonstrated that most people would deliver a lethal electric shock to a stranger if they were told to by a person in authority. John Darley and Bib Latane found that the more people are watching an emergency, the less likely it is that any one person will intervene. Martin Seligman showed, gruesomely, that dogs exposed to an uncontrollable series of random shocks will develop a condition of quote-unquote learned helplessness, and would stop trying to escape even when given the opportunity. In all of these experiments, a certain number of people resisted. Some of Asch's subjects insisted on the reality of what they saw, regardless of what the group said. Some, in Milgram's experiment, refused to give the lethal shock, and when someone in the room showed defiance, other experimental participants would also refuse to cooperate. Some of Seligman's dogs never became helpless. They kept on fighting to free themselves until they succeeded. Next.
I forgot to unmute myself. These who resisted had a certain kind of character. They refused to conform, and they refused to give in. Perhaps not surprisingly, the people I spoke to shared personality characteristics that made them psychologically able to resist: intelligence and thoughtfulness, confidence, a certain rebellious streak usually balanced with an ability to relate to others. Seligman, in later psychology research with humans, found similar characteristics that made people able to resist learned helplessness. Resistors have a reputation for being rebellious, but rarely are effective resistors total outcasts or social loners, at least not in adulthood. A resistance movement is a political endeavor. It succeeds through group action. As Hirsch explains, quote, consciousness raising is not likely to take place among socially marginal individuals because such isolation implies difficulty in communicating ideas to others, end quote. Older psychology research started from the assumption that protesters were pathological. Quote, marginal, insecure, irrational people join these movements because they provide needed social direction unavailable from existing social institutions, end quote. The reality is quite the opposite, of course. Hirsch explains, quote, the setting in which political protest movements originate is not typically characterized by confusion, insecurity, or unrest, but by careful planning by close-knit groups of politically committed activists, end quote. Writing about members of the French resistance, historian Julian Jackson explained, quote, these were not maladjusted mavericks, although clearly they were individuals of exceptional strong-mindedness, ready to break with family and friends, end quote. Mm, I don't know if that image on the right side of the page is something I'm supposed to. I can't really even see something about. It looks like a triskelion, but personal experience. Anyway, the people I spoke to had varied backgrounds in terms of class, ethnicity, and place of origin. Few of them were raised in radical families. Those who were came mostly from whole entire communities of resistance, like indigenous groups. Similarly, few were raised in conservative or right-wing families. Most explained that at least one parent or adult in their childhood was liberal. As children, they absorbed basic values of equality, fairness, and anti-discrimination, and so on. This is also something found in studies of 60s student radicals. One young man, not from a radical family, explained, quote, "The values I got from my family, the ones that I've kept, are good. I've pared and peeled them to fit my own style, but there is a good continuity here," end quote. On the other hand, explains Kenneth Keniston, for those, quote, who came from military liberal or radical family background, or militantly liberal or radical family backgrounds, the awareness of becoming a radical was essentially a realization of reconnection with one's roots, end quote. There are there are basic personality characteristics that make people more likely to resist, but traits like intelligence and confidence alone don't make a resistor. Something more is required. I think we can boil down the key elements to a radical triad, three key ingredients that move people from dissidents to active resistors. Those ingredients are personal experiences, radical catalysts, and action needs. Next.
There is personal experiences. All of the people I spoke to or studied had radicalizing personal experiences, usually when they were young. Many of them experienced oppression or injustice personally, of types ranging from childhood abuse and rape to poverty and genocide. Family history was important. One person had a grandmother who organized against the fascists in Spain. Others had family who had survived the Nazi Holocaust or fought colonialism in the global South. Many resistors' families told them stories that helped inoculate them against injustice. Closely witnessing injustice can also have a radicalizing effect. Author Stieg Larsson, who wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and campaigned against the extreme right as a journalist, was radicalized in part because as a young man he watched the gang rape of a teenage girl and did nothing. Many of the people I spoke to were, as children, very concerned about the treatment of animals and other living creatures. Most told me that they were worried about fairness as children and that they would get into arguments when people were not being treated fairly. These experiences of injustice or oppression go hand in hand with a distrust of authority. Personal abuse often happens at the hands of an authority figure. Some people were racially profiled, harassed, or arrested by police as youths. Others were taught from a young age to think critically about news reports and statements made by politicians, and so came to distrust authority. I believe people must have some experience as outsiders in order to become radicals. For most people, conformity is comforting. The experience of being an outsider helps people develop the strength of character to do what is right, even when it isn't popular. More than a few people I interviewed were teenage goths, nerds, hippies, or punks. I dyed my hair green and got a skateboard. I didn't want to fit into this world. End quote. Keniston noted that the 1960s student radicals who he spoke to also felt different from their peers when they were young, noting their childhood involvement with social and political issues. He argues, quote, "These young radicals were concerned with moral issues at an age when most of their classmates were not. And although most had a circle of close friends, these friends were usually others like themselves, intellectually able, active, and vigorous children who knew how to lead in the defense of an unpopular cause." End quote. To become a radical, one must also experience the failure of traditional or low risk methods of social change. Almost everyone I spoke with began their activism with low-risk activities like protest and lobbying. When those methods didn't work, they became disillusioned and developed a growing distrust of authority. This is important. To become a radical, a person must be committed enough to pursue social or political change until they fail. And they must be committed and strong enough that once they have witnessed the failure of superficial methods of change, they continue to seek out more profound and effective methods. People who develop radical political consciousness must experience these things personally. Only direct experience seems to be real enough and intense enough to change someone as a person. Just reading about something or watching it on television isn't enough. Next.
Radical catalysts. Potential resistors need time, analytical tools, and a community for dialogue and action. Experiences of oppression and abuse of authority do not turn most people into radicals. If it were intrinsically radicalizing to be racially profiled or exploited by an employer or talked down to for being a woman, then we would have no shortage of radicals. Obviously, something more is needed to catalyze that transformation. To become radicalized, people need time to consider their experiences and to gain some psychological distance from traumatic or confusing events. They need analytical tools to understand their experiences and put them in a political context. And they need people they can talk to about these things, especially a community of people with similar experiences. One man told me about being a child in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, watching the American troops and planes prepare for bombing runs on Iraq. After the war and in economic downturn, nationalist movements demanded Arab jobs for Arab people. His family was South Asian, so they immigrated to the United States. He was the only person of color in his entire high school in a town with an active Ku Klux Klan. After September 11, he and his father were targeted by anti-immigrant security fever and charged with harming national security interests. Without being given any information about what that meant or why they were being charged, they were forced to show up for regular court appearances and interrogations on threat of deportation. Eventually, the FBI even tried to recruit him to inform on Black Muslims. Finally, things reached a breaking point, and he fled to Canada, using a student visa to go to graduate school. He explained to me that he wasn't able to process all of his experiences to develop political consciousness until after he had left the United States and started his graduate program. There, he explained he had both the time and the analytical tools needed to process and understand his experiences in a political way. Psychologist Martin Seligman, in his research on learned helplessness, found people are more prone to learn helplessness if their worldview or explanatory style is pessimistic. He uses that term in a specific way. Pessimists believe bad things that happen to them are personal, permanent, and pervasive. That is, something bad happened to me because of my own personal faults and shortcomings. Bad things will happen forever, and bad things will happen everywhere I go. Seligman argues that to overcome learned helplessness and the associated feelings of defeat and depression, people must learn optimism, overcoming the sense that they are personally to blame for systemic injustice. Radicals understand that while discrimination may be targeted at individuals, it's not just an individual issue. There are systemic causes. That's the real meaning of the slogan, "The personal is political." A process of political awakening is partly about putting those radicalizing personal experiences into a political context, understanding that they are more than just personal, they are structural. They are the result of actual systems of power and oppression. This doesn't just radicalize us, it motivates us and keeps us sane. As one feminist said, if you really understand that the problems are out there, instead of blaming yourself, it makes you willing to take more risks. It makes you more motivated to fight the motherfuckers. If I didn't have that base to latch onto, I would just go nuts. End quote. At the same time as we learn that injustices are not purely personal, we can come to understand that the systems of power responsible are not permanent or entirely pervasive. Patriarchy has not existed in every culture. Capitalism cannot assimilate every community. Not all relationships are a struggle for dominance. Empires always fall. Sometimes time to think and the direct experience of oppression go hand in hand. Many a radical has emerged out of prison. As a teenager, Malcolm Little was a drug dealer, burglar, and cocaine addict. When arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison, he could barely read and write. He resolved to educate himself and copied out the entire dictionary by hand. Soon he read voraciously, studying abolitionist books and history. He joined the Nation of Islam and changed his name to Malcolm X. Prison was also a radicalizing factor for the George Jackson Brigade, a West Coast urban guerrilla group. Ed Mead and John Sherman, founding members of the group, were radicalized while reading Marx in prison. Next. I'm going to leave that to you, Daniel.
Great. Okay, so we got a table here. It's basically about that like pessimist versus optimist split that was being discussed a minute ago, and it gives examples. So like I'll just go left. Like first I'll read the pessimist one, and then I'll read the optimist one, and then those will like act as contrasts. So the pessimist personal version is I'm poor because I'm not smart enough and I just don't work hard enough. Whereas the optimist radical version is we are poor because capitalism exploits us and the rich have rigged the system. The pessimist individualist perspective is men talk over me because I seem weak. And the optimist radical version is men talk over me because of patriarchy. So continuing on, the police attacked that young black man because he looked suspicious. He shouldn't have worn that hoodie, as opposed to the police racially profile black men no matter how they're dressed. He also categorizes that that's personal versus external or systemic. And here we have pervasive versus specific. So like there are poor people everywhere. There's no way to escape it. That's pervasive. Specific is inequality in this country is among the worst of all developed countries. Many places have lower poverty rates. Pervasive, it's normal for men to mistreat women. Boys will be boys. Specific, not all societies are patriarchal. Not all cultures are rape cultures. Pervasive, it's natural for white people to run society. Specific, most cultures and most of history have not been ruled by white people. There's also this distinction about duration between permanent and temporary. Permanent, there have always been severe poverty, patriarchy, and racism, and there always will be. Temporary, systems of power like capitalism, sexism, and racism were constructed, some quite recently, and so they can be dismantled or destroyed. They won't last forever, and it's our job to accelerate their abolition. All right, that was the table. Back to the text. Such experiences give people a sense of perspective and scale when they undertake struggle. Those who have lived lives of great privilege and comfort rarely have the courage to take real risks. But when you face oppression and abuse on a daily basis, it changes how you perceive the risks of resistance. When asked by a French journalist whether he feared being arrested and imprisoned in the United States, Black Panther Stokely Carmichael responded, "I was born in jail." Analytical tools for radicalization come in too many forms to list. Sometimes the tools are political ideologies like Marxism or socialism. Sometimes they're worldviews or perspectives like feminism or anti-authoritarianism. Sometimes they are embedded inside religion like liberation theology or the Nation of Islam, or in sports or community activities. Sometimes they are part of arts and culture, in novels or film, or in hip-hop or punk music. But coming to political awareness is not an experience most resistors can go through alone. We need a community. We need people, both for dialogue and action. In the 1960s and 70s, consciousness-raising groups and rap sessions were fundamental methods for the growth of the women's movement and of movements against racism and homophobia. These consciousness-raising groups worked because they were, and still are, places where people can feel at home, can feel safe, could share their feelings with people who have common experiences, and where people can help each other put those feelings and experiences into a wider political context. These three radical catalysts, time, tools, and people, are often present at colleges and universities, which is why those places can be hotbeds of activism. But many university militants don't stay that way. Some of them, from privileged backgrounds, may lack the first component, the strong personal experiences that underlie enduring radicalism. Others, perhaps, lack the third component, necessities for ongoing action. I'll just pass it here. Next.
All right, the next section says action needs. In order to progress from merely having radical ideas, In order to progress from merely having radical ideas to undertaking radical action, people need something more. They need a community of people to take action with, B, models for action, C, a mental narrative of how social change happens or an imminent danger that demands immediate response, D, a sense that winning is possible or perhaps that they have nothing left to lose, E, biographical availability. Rarely do people take radical action alone. They need a group with whom they can have political discussion and take action. Without this, the contradiction of radical beliefs and their own lack of effective action cause them to spiral into defeatism. As Kenneth Keniston writes, can you scroll up? Daniel, can you scroll up? Thank you. As Kenneth Keniston writes, many Americans share radical perceptions, delusions, and interpretations of our society, but are embittered, soured, alienated, or apathetic. They are curdled idealists, but not active radicals. Such individuals can at most be considered latent radicals, or they lack a commitment to action and a sense of engagement with others who seek to change society. A further process of activation and engagement is therefore essential in the making of a radical. Not only must the individual perceive social reality in a certain light, but he must come to feel personally responsible for affecting change. He must acquire models of commitment and action, and he must somehow deal with the issue of his effectiveness as a radical political actor. No doubt the great majority of latent radicals are prevented from radicalism because they lack these further qualities. They feel no personal responsibility for remedying the injustices they perceive. They possess no models for action, or they have little hope that their efforts will be effective, resigning themselves with, quote, "what is the use?" Models for action are essential. We need other people or movements to emulate, at least as a starting point. Witness what happened in the Arab Spring when a few triggering events avalanched into massive mobilizations. Or witness what happened with the Occupy movement that followed, inspired in part by the mass protests in Tahrir Square or Black Lives Matter. Sometimes the models are people, sometimes the models are themselves forms of action. But models are needed, and so are stories. This is why a culture of resistance is so important, why it is essential that we remember the struggles that have gone before us. Both movements and people need some narrative of change, a sense that winning is possible, that the cost and sacrifice of struggle will be worth it in the end. Next.
Some understanding of how change happens, a narrative or theory of change, is also important to shape strategy and give real hope. This could be a detailed political ideology, but even a general knowledge of historical change can be enough. Of course, extreme desperation can also be a triggering factor. There is a difference between movements that emerge out of relative privilege and those that emerge from profound deprivation. People who take profound risks usually do so because they feel that they have nothing left to lose. So it was for those who resisted in the Nazi concentration camps and ghettos, in uprisings by many indigenous people and among the very poor. Latin American guerrilla movements can illustrate the importance of a culture of resistance, deprivation, and an active threat. Sociologist Timothy Wickham Crowley found that 1960s guerrillas were able to recruit most successfully among peasants whose land was at risk, as in Cuba, Mexico, or El Salvador. Cuban guerrilla strongholds in the 1960s were areas with large numbers of squatters and sharecroppers. The same was true for Nicaragua in the 1970s. In the 1970s and 80s in Guatemala, guerrillas were most concentrated in areas home to more migrant laborers. Guerrilla recruitment was most successful when there were active attempts by the rich to dislocate peasants from their land, and less successful where peasants had already been dispossessed. A culture of resistance is critical, as Wickham Crowley writes. Guerrilla movements also disproportionately took root in areas with histories of popular rebellion against national authorities, and often failed where such rebellious cultures were absent. In the Cuban case, Oriente Province had been the locus of slave revolts, anti-Spanish rebellions, and civil wars, and anti-government movements since the early 1800s. Che Guevara's failed rebellion in Bolivia, a country that had hosted literally thousands of peasant movements in the past century, was mistakenly launched in a part of Bolivia that had hosted relatively few of those movements. Most of the people I interviewed were either middle class or working class. This is partly a reflection of my own social networks and movement connections, and partly a reflection of the demographics of resistance and protest in North America. Those raised in the most affluent families are mostly enculturated in the norms of the upper classes and have no interest in revolution. There may be an optimal range for organized resistance centered between the middle and working class, where people have enough to get by, but not so much that they become complacent. Those at the top are mostly too entitled to resist, and those at the very bottom are often occupied with the emergencies of daily life. Though relatively privileged, there are reasons that people with middle class backgrounds are well represented among radicals. Middle class activists may have more biographical availability, free time to engage in projects outside of work and family. This is important for action. Young people without full time jobs and dependents have a lot of biographical availability. People who are taking care of kids or who have multiple jobs or who spend a lot of time and energy dealing with health issues have reduced biographical availability, and groups wanting to recruit and include them must account for that. Members of the middle class in general have more free time and more access to some of the intellectual tools that catalyze radicalization. They can probably afford to go to university, a commonplace of radicalization. With material needs met, they can look to other goals. Next.
A few generations ago, the working class in North America had much clearer routes to radicalism. Leftist radicalism in the early 20th century was strongly based in the union battles of the working class. But over the decades, unions have diminished in both power and radicalism. Some of the politically stronger unions represent middle-class workers with well-paying jobs who now have a lot to lose. The masses of poor factory workers who rallied for socialism at the end of the Industrial Revolution don't exist anymore in North America. Most manufacturing jobs have been outsourced overseas. At the same time, employment has shifted toward non-unionized jobs in the service industry. These jobs may be dreadful, but they don't provide the same opportunities for radicalization once offered by unions like the industrial workers of the world. If we want to create new routes to radicalization, we must consider again the radical triad. The radical triad of personal experiences, radical catalysts, and action needs is not a straightforward sequence of phases, but a cycle. Confronting systems of power, provides us with new radicalizing personal experiences, not all of them pleasant. We consider and comprehend those experiences and integrate them into our own strategic thinking and personal motivations, and we develop stronger communities for action. And then there's a radical triad figure. Personal experiences, firsthand or witness oppression, radical catalyst, time plus tools plus people, action needs, community plus models plus narrative. As we move through this cycle again and again, we accumulate more radicalizing personal experiences, more of the tools and people that let us understand the world in a radical way, and more of the necessities for action. The effect is not a single circle, but a spiraling, radicalizing trajectory that can deepen our motivation to create change, our understanding of the world, and our efficacy in struggle. Of course, personal trajectories are only one part of what makes resistance grow and thrive. Recruitment depends on the complex interplay between individual radicalization, group formation, and the dynamics of the outside world. In other words, it depends on movements. Effective recruitment. It's good to understand why people become radicals in general and how movements grow and develop. But recruitment is ultimately practical, not theoretical. And history offers us many different practical approaches to choose from. Powerful movements tend to use many methods at once. The Black Panther Party, BPP, use broad-based approaches including posters, pamphlets, and newspapers. But they also recruited by identifying the worst outrages against their community, police brutality, hunger, poverty, and taking decisive action to address those problems. They instituted survival programs like soup kitchens, free breakfast programs for kids, and medical clinics. The Panthers would bail people out of jail or show up with their guns when a person was being arrested and loudly explain the arrestees' legal rights to everyone in earshot. A number of Panthers said that the police did more recruiting for the BPP than did the party itself. Their use of direct action often won them a lot of support from the community. An example, in early 1967, the Panthers observed that there was a particular dangerous intersection at which several young children had been killed. Panther members collected signatures and petitioned the city council for a traffic light. The BPP were informed that it would take more than a year to put a traffic light in place. Dissatisfied by this response, the Panthers went down to the intersection themselves, guns in hand, and started to direct traffic. When the Oakland police realized what was happening, they offered to take over traffic direction themselves. Traffic lights were installed the following week. Next.
All right. That is the end of the reading section. Now we can proceed on to the discussion section. And generally, I would just turn the floor over to y'all, but I think that right there is the reason why that the Black Panthers are beloved even by anarchists. And that's because that is direct action, right? Like that is like, it's funny because they started by petitioning the state, which is not direct action. But when the state didn't do what they wanted, they didn't just like go, oh man, we should like carry out an extensive campaign to keep petitioning the state. No, they just said, no, okay, fine. We'll do it ourselves. We're going to directly intervene and provide the service we think is needed. If the state won't provide it, we'll provide it. We already asked. They said no. We'll provide it ourselves. And it got the original desired effect, which is just really that they put the traffic light in. But I think this is like a perfect example of how we should approach these sorts of struggles. So I'll hand the floor over to everybody else. Anybody have any thoughts, comments on the text we read this evening?
Yeah, I'm hoping that, I know that we read this before, but I can't remember if he did go into detail about the conflict resolution parts. And I'm trying to remember if he said, like, we'll get into this in so-and-so chapter. But he brought it up, and I really very firmly agree and have always felt that if you if there's something that you need to address with your comrade or ally, to do it in private, for most cases, as he said. And I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of people that have the culture of defeat, I feel that they really jump into public criticisms that aren't really even, or takedowns even, that aren't really something that needs to be discussed publicly. But I think, it's a way for people to gain social capital. So I'm hoping that he goes further into conflict resolution steps, because I think that a lot of people really don't know how to resolve conflict. They don't know how to have conflict, healthy conflict that is like solutions oriented. And it just results in a lot of fractures, or people just simply, leaving the movement.
I agree with that 1,000%. And my personal feeling is that is largely because of the sort of culture that the internet has created, where on the internet, the only power that we do have is call outs. And so people really got addicted to the power of call outs because it made them feel strong. But then it mostly was aimed toward their allies than it was toward the enemy.
That's the closest thing that a lot of the people that maybe don't have the components of the radical triad, like that feeling of separating themselves from this person that they are deeming less radical than thou, like doing that on the internet, that's the closest they get to it. Like there's I'm missing the tail end of this thought, but I'll be chewing on it for a while.
Well, you don't have to rush through the thought. If you want to give yourself a second to kind of reflect, feel free.
I'll come back around to it, I'm sure.
Anybody else had any thoughts about that section?
I think, bouncing off of what S said, I think that we, have a just an epidemic of people who have such low self-esteem. Of course, I'm not saying that that's their fault, but people that feel so deeply insecure by design, that I think that they almost feel like they can't be better. And again, this goes back to the what was it, the individualist defeatist um attitude that he was talking about, where people are like, well, I can't be I can't be better than I am, but if I can like take this person down a peg, then I can feel like at least I'm not as big of a piece of shit as that person over there who like used the unpopular word or whatever it is. And I think that's like their only way of feeling slightly less like a piece of shit. It's sad. I mean, I'm saying this from a place of empathy, um, in that, I would like everyone to feel, confident enough that they don't feel the need to pull others down so that they feel a little bit better about themselves for 5 minutes. But yeah, I think that's all part of it. Yeah, pessimist, individualist.
Yeah, I brought
Yeah,
up
the
brought
whole
it up
I'm
for you.
poor because I'm not smart enough and I just don't work hard enough. But those attitudes are internalized things that we're conditioned. Like we're conditioned to think that we're not good enough, that we're stupid, that we're bad, like inherently bad or inherently wrong, that our existence is some like thing to be debated. And so I think people really deeply internalize that to the point that they just don't feel like they can be any better than they are. Like, and the point is that they don't like need to be, like inherently you are enough, but you don't have to like tear people down.
Yeah, I think S was also kind of on something to say that a lot of these people haven't had the like personal radicalizing experiences. They haven't had the personal experience component, right?
Yeah. I was
Uh,
just bouncing off of it, not
yeah.
trying to finish there.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with both of those statements. The thing that I really was taking away from that text there, I think the part that stuck out to me, because this is something that's come up so much in discussions with other radicals, is just like what are the ingredients that lead to radicalization, lead to a person becoming a radical. And I liked that he didn't like shy away from the answer and go, it's all contextual, like, nah, he just like gave us an answer. And his answer is that there are three qualities or three ingredients to the mixture. The first is personal experience. So a firsthand witness of oppression, that could be themselves experiencing it or just seeing it happen to other people. Either ways is enough. The second one is radical catalysts, which he separates into three subcategories. Time, in other words, the time to engage with the radical materials or to become radicalized. Tools, which he means by all kinds of things. But I think he was giving, like, Malcolm X was like the dictionary. I don't know if that fits into here or in models, but tools, I'm going to look that up here in a second and kind of find the context for it, plus people. So that's interesting. I'll come back to that one in a moment. But action needs, that one went in even more detail. He says action needs could be, he lists out a community of people to take action with. So there you go. B, models for action. So I'd say that's like theory for the most part, but he gave a bunch of examples. C, a mental narrative of how social change happens or an imminent danger that demands a response. So in other words, just some mental conception of social change. D, a sense that winning is possible or perhaps that they have nothing left to lose. And then E, biographical availability. In other words, the ability, the personal ability to engage with all of this and to engage with being an organizer or radical of some sort. And I appreciated that he just laid out a thesis here. What do people think of the thesis?
I think it's a really I mean, it's very well explained, and it's a very useful framework, specifically in, like, for people that are kind of getting into, radicalization, figuring out, like, okay, where does this framework fit over my lived experiences, and how can I participate in the movements with that, like, within that framework. I really loved the table with the both the pessimist and optimist, or rather the wokeisms on the one side, like, I don't know about y'all, but, like, if I'm just, like, having conversations with people around me that aren't necessarily radicals, I feel like I'm definitely like that commie buzzkill in every conversation where I'm just like, no, actually that's that. That's actually that. Like, and seeing it, like, laid out that way with those very clear textual examples was great. So all in all, fantastic section.
Yeah, I brought up the section where he's talking about the second The second category, the radical catalysts, because time is pretty obvious, I think. But like for me, I read this and I'm like, what's the difference between tools and models, and what's the what's the difference between tools, models, and narratives? Because like when I go and I look at it, the tools part, let's see here. Okay, so analytical tools for radicalization. He gives political ideologies, worldviews and perspectives. Religion is another example, right? So like theory, worldviews. I'm making notes of this right now. And then people is easy. That's just people to act with. But I wonder what is his discernment here between tools and models. I get, because like here he says models for action, and then the narrative he expands as a mental narrative of how social change happens. So what I'm trying to do right now is kind of discern what the difference is between, say, theory, a worldview, and a model or narrative of how change happens. I'm trying to figure out what is he discerning here? What is the important discerning factor?
I don't know if this addresses that exactly, but it feels like the sense of like what a model is in this case. I feel like that's kind of the greater thesis of almost this entire text, having not read any further than this, of course. But like it is, because tools are, when I think of the difference between the two, like the tool is specifically like the medium that you are working through and examining. But like one thing that so many like radical, like people that would be radical thinkers and radical movements now, is that if you like, we don't see and hear about a lot of models of successful like things, like we don't, all of that knowledge is so purposefully oppressed in our culture, so we don't have models for other ways of existing. And so I think that it kind of comes down to like a sense of radical imagination, and like modeling versus like, okay, here are the things through which you're exploring that, but you have to have these greater like concepts and places to take it. I don't know.
Yeah, it makes sense. I reading through the text, I'm actually having a hard time discerning them, because it seems to me that an ideology does kind of lay out a model for action, which is what he means by model here. He's saying model for action. The narrative, a mental narrative of how social change happens. But once again, it seems to me that that's like part of ideology. So there might just be some overlap here. But I guess more explicitly, the model is the model for action. So not just like hierarchy is bad, but like I'm an anarcho-syndicalist, so I think unions work, something like that, right? Not just an abstract analysis of power, but also like how do you change things? Not just a religious worldview, but a belief about how to make change. And then a mental narrative of how social change happens. Once again, that seems like that strong overlap with ideology, but yeah, no, I still think this is a very useful a guide to understanding what makes somebody become a radical.
Yeah, I just think of the analytical tools being like a lens that you're given to view things. Because I don't think this is like the action part. I think this is just like the like identifying what the real problem is, which to me, I think that's like just giving people a lens, and that being the analytical tool. Like I can identify that a lot of men speak to me in a certain way because they have patriarchy internalized, and I can see that because I am viewing it through a feminist lens.
Right, which doesn't necessarily unfold a model for action then, right? Just to understand the structure, I suppose.
Like there are the vast majority of people that are on the left have a really good lens to view things, but they have no mode of action.
Yeah,
So I think
that's
those
the
are
concerning part here.
different, and it's so much so that when those two things collide with the way of thinking and also the way of doing, you have a word for that, praxis,
Right.
and it has to have a word because it's a very specific thing when they do collide.
True. That's actually a good point. Okay, so tools plus models equals praxis.
Yeah.
There we go. That makes sense.
So I think it's
And I think that.
Mhm. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying, I think that with the definitions of these that he's using, I think that's accurate.
I also think that you could also kind of think of it in terms of like moving from like the theoretical to the models and the taking action. Feels to me like that tipping point where the pessimism turns into the optimism. Like there, it seems correlated to me, because I know tons of people that have done reading and have a theoretical understanding of everything, but find themselves stuck in that sense of like, oh well, the systems are too big, like they can't see any other way forward. So like I don't know, there's a kind of shared trajectory there.
Yeah, agreed. I think that when all you have is like the tools, all you have is ideology, but you don't have a model for action, it leads to sort of pessimistic spinning of one's wheels.
Yeah, I think this is why I'm such a big proponent of like what we're doing with Cooperation Tulsa, or we're building the world that we want, because there are so many people that are unimaginative, and they just don't they won't even believe that it's possible until they see it in action. And like, kind of off topic, but this is kind of like a discussion that I've been having, which is that people who read fantasy, I think that like they are better at understanding that we can build a better world, because world building is kind of like structured into reading fantasy, that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. I think the same thing for sci-fi, to be honest.
Well, I'm talking about sci-fi as well whenever I say fantasy. So
Yeah.
like, it could be sci-fi, or it could be like especially if you play like tabletop role playing games.
I agree with you 100%. I think that those two genres especially are really transformative to people's thinking, because they force you to think about completely different paradigms and cultures. And so then that acquaints you with the fact that there are completely different paradigms and cultures, that everything is not like over determined. But yeah, no, we still have like 10 minutes left. There's actually like a lot of good insights in this section. Andrew, Jen, I noticed that y'all haven't said anything here. Do y'all have any thoughts about the text? I'll take that as a no.
Well, something that came to my mind, and it's kind of tangential, but something that came to my mind, like in reading this, was I was like reminded that like this is why every time fascism rises, like one of their primary targets is often like autistic people. And I'm reminded in this section that that's probably because autistic people have that what do they call it? The moral rigidity, and like refusing to just accept what it is, and being able to see that like just because something is and has been, it doesn't necessarily mean that it should be, because it's nonsense and there can be something better. Whereas I think a lot of neurotypical people just kind of accept what is as like, that's just how it's always going to be. That's the only thing that can be. So kind of made me think about that a lot.
I will repeat my old hot
Yes.
take. Oh shit. I can hear myself coming through somebody's speaker there. I'll repeat my old hot take that autistic people are the shock troopers of revolution. They're the people that are going to take the risks, the ideological risks, and the risks of action well before neurotypical society has caught up with those perspectives.
Absolutely, they're the pattern finders, and they're that sense of justice is so just like what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. It's just
Ingrained.
it's
Rigid.
yeah, it's just such a huge part of that. And that kind of leads me to something I was thinking about when there we go. Whenever they were talking about the time and the other resources to like the radical catalysts, like having the time to be able to participate in these things, and generally like the more disenfranchised a person is like by the systems, the harder they have to work and the less time and like personal energy and resources that they have. And that got me thinking about like disability politics and how that comes in here, and like how like the disability community are like the canaries in the coal mine for anything really messed up that's happening in a society. And the way that they are just like kept out of movement so often, just because they because of the disabilities and the ability to engage either physically or mentally. Like it's just this huge again, I'm having a hard time tying up my thoughts. This is very common for my brain, and I don't want to just ramble, but anyway.
You should feel okay with rambling. I think that's really the whole point of the discussion section, is that now you consumed the material, you've digested. Now tell us what the results are. And if that's meandering, it's fine. You're probably still kind of digesting.
Jen said she liked the point about the real sacrifices needed for action. And, it also talking about most people are not willing to give up their minor comforts and social status. And I think that's very true. And I know that this text has mentioned that several times, that people are willing to put up with just about any horrors, as long as they still have like a nice phone or something. As long as you still have like a gaming console, like who cares if we're all going to the gulag? I mean,
yeah, I'm trying to find the paragraphs where that was being discussed. But yeah, I mean, it was basically just saying like, you might sacrifice your friends and your family and your social circle, and you might end up being at risk at your job and all of that. Like those are big sacrifices that a person might be, not very willing to make. And I think one of the important things about this book, and one of the reasons why I'm such a big advocate for this book, is because he keeps returning to like, everything keeps coming back to, yeah, that's why it's so important that we get wins. Right? That's why it's so important that we get wins, because it makes all of this worth it. It makes all the struggle worth it. It makes all the sacrifice and the stress worth it. We have to like be able to develop these sort of like concrete goals, and then actually achieve those goals. Or if we don't achieve them outright, that's understandable, but at least have to have made some kind of step in the right direction, because that's what keeps people around after all those sacrifices.
Yeah, that's pretty much why I refuse to engage in like high risk, low benefit activities, because like I want to have a win. I'm not just doing this just to do it. I have an end goal. Jen says you can definitely see people in history who are really committed to the sacrifices. That is correct. And I would also like to point out that for every one person in history who you can see that really committed to those sacrifices, there are hundreds who you will never hear about, because part of them committing to the movements and to, radical change was that they had to disappear. They had to live in exile and anonymity, and we will never know their names. And we only know like just a handful out of them. And I feel like if someone really needs praise and recognition and needs to be remembered in history, I feel like maybe they might not end up being quite as effective as the people who were simply willing to just disappear into anonymity as they were going to in the first place. Because I don't think anybody's like gonna remember me, 20 years after I'm gone, after the people that know me now pass away. Nobody's gonna remember me, and I'm fine with that. I would very happily disappear into anonymity if I had the ability to. But I feel like a lot of people don't want that. Like, I think that they really want that. They want to stand out in the pages of history.
Yeah, they want
And
the recognition.
The recognition, yeah, and the eternal recognition and remembrance and going down in history. And I think that prevents a lot of progress, a lot of success, because being successful, history is written by the victors. It's so interesting how all of the history books, all the people writing the history books happen to be the good guy.
Right. One thing that occurs to me about the recognition thing, and this is something that I've sort of discovered in my own life, is I think that there's a paradox in this, and that is that the person who will put their nose to the grindstone and do the work without the recognition eventually will become so accomplished that they will probably get recognition. But the person who goes around constantly wanting recognition will probably achieve very little and will only be a celebrity in their own mind. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, gaining celebrity is honestly kind of a full-time job, as I understand it.
Yes, I think that it's about keeping one's mind upon the actions, about getting things done, and then eventually you'll have a track record behind you, and you will get recognition organically. Not you. If you do it for recognition, it will be empty, and you probably won't get the recognition that you desire. But if you do it for the sake of doing it, not for the sake of recognition, you may just get recognition as a byproduct. That's my experience. And I think that's been what I've seen for a lot of people. So I think that's a challenge, though. If you go into it for the wrong reasons, that doesn't sound very satisfying. However, that is about it for our evening tonight, or for our reading group tonight. I appreciate everybody showing up, both here in the reading group and in the live streams. We got like 16 viewers right now. Good discussion afterwards, a good section of reading. I hope everybody who's watching afterwards enjoys the live stream. Also, I just want to remind you that if you want to be in the actual reading group and you want to be in the discussion, you should go over to our open collective and you should become a recurring donor for any amount, and then communicate with us somehow to tell us that you have become a recurring donor. We will give you a link both to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord server, which is probably the most useful thing to get here, but then also a link to these chats that you see on screen. That's how you get access to that. Also, you get the satisfaction of knowing you are supporting a dual power project, a food sovereignty project here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So go over, become a recurring donor for Cooperation Tulsa. Also, for those of you who are tuned in right now, do not forget that on next Monday, we will be having a popular education group. So also, you'll get access to that link to the popular education group that happens on alternating Mondays from the organizer education group. I think that's the spiel. It's no longer Theo. Theo has handed it off to a couple new people. It's that's how we're proceeding forward.
I'll still be posting the link on our social media. So I'm still managing the social media. So I'll be posting the link for popular education along with like a heads up of what we're going to be watching every Monday. So if you follow our social media accounts, I always post the link there.
There you have it. All right, everybody. Appreciate you all tuning in. Appreciate everybody showing up to read. I'll see you week after next. Have a good one.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye.